Welcome to our Sierra Club New York City group presentation on zoning. Thank you for joining us this evening for this exciting program. Sierra Club is the oldest, largest grassroots environmental organization in the United States. My name is Catherine Skopik, and I'm chair of this group. The New York City Group Sustainability Series is pleased to present this event. And I am pleased to introduce to you the person who organized this event and who will be your host. She is one of the hardest, smartest workers I know to make this city a better, more just, more inclusive city and a better planet. And here she is, Lucy Coteen.
Yay. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for your kind words. And I'm so pleased to welcome all my friends here who are here as to watch and enjoy this exciting event. I am so looking forward to hearing our three distinguished presenters tonight. They are familiar to some of you, and some of you have worked with all of them, and some of you have worked with one of them. To many of us who have been involved in zoning and development struggles and even lawsuits, we see these three people as heroes. Before we begin, I want to let you know that we plan to make available a post-webinar Zoom link for those who have more questions and want to engage in further discussion. We are moving there because of limitations in this webinar format. Later in the chat, we will share a link with you. Please be patient when we move to the Zoom, as it may take a minute or two to admit all those who are interested. You can put questions in this chat here, as you can see, I guess. But thank you, Linda Violette. I just saw her comment. You can put questions in this chat, but because of time limits, we may not get to all of them. Catherine will keep an eye out for questions in the chat. One more thing, I think it would be of great interest to all of us for anyone involved in a current fight or past fight or a lawsuit to share that information in the chat. And also, if you have a website associated with your fight, you can include it. So it is my great pleasure to introduce MAUREEN KOETZ, who has served as an advisor, an environmental consultant, a legal consultant, and an educator to many groups around the city. And I'm going to let MAUREEN, she can best introduce herself and her distinguished history. And she's going to follow that with a slide presentation. And then we'll take a few questions. And then we will proceed to Professor Tom Ngadi and ALICIA Boyd, a wonderful community activist, educator, and writer. And all of you are fantastic people. And I look forward to hearing you speak. So MAUREEN, are you ready?
Ready. Thanks, Lucy. Good evening. Pleasure to be here with Sierra Club, two of my favorite colleagues, and all of those of you tuning in. I'm very honored to be here tonight to talk about some of the work I've done in the past, and particularly the work we're trying to do here in New York City regarding some of the most oppressive megazonings and geocapital, as I like to call it, failures I've come across in a 4-decade history working on these issues. A quick background, I'm a Jamaica Queens native, but I've spent most of my career in Washington, D.C. in various jobs in the legislative and executive branches. My most recent job was the acting assistant secretary of the Air Force for something called Installations, Environment, and Logistics, which effectively made me the chief sustainability officer of the Air Force. Wow. And when you have to take care of about 10 million acres and an enormous amount of water and airspace and airshed and airwaves and land and buildings and do construction, you're bound to identify a few things that you think maybe we could do differently or better. And so I'd like to talk to you tonight a little bit about what I've learned in terms of where we started in all of this back in the late 1960s, really, when we started to formalize what we now call environmental law, and really where we should be thinking of going in this new century. And you'll see from the slides, which I'll discuss a little bit, why I think we're kind of a little behind. So if you'll give me a minute to get my desktop arranged here. This worked when we practiced. So let's see. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about something called political economy. Not that I do that for a living, but you almost have to know about political economy if you're going to work in what I call geocapital space. And one of the things you'll notice is I don't say the E word anymore. I think of air, land, and water as geocapital assets. I think it's time that the planet got co-equal billing with people, buildings, and money. So I'm going to unilaterally give it to it. And so here we go. So, and I ask you all to take notice of our beautiful pink Princess Slimline with a lighted rotary dial, because it has a great deal of symbolic significance as we keep going. That's a little bit about me. Like I say, we can talk about that. I've had the pleasure of working with ALICIA in MTOPP cases. I advised 2 bridges and the lesson folks when we successfully won the case in lower court regarding the massive towerization of 2 bridges. I've done a lot of work at South Street Seaport. And I've been trying to work on this idea that air, land, and water have got to be treated as assets, or we're never really going to do the job we need to do for them. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about what I see are two of the 2 converging problems. One is a little more on the substantive side, and the other one is on the process side. And then I'll go through some of what I think why this is a reality for developers, development, communities who are interested in containing development and assuring that it is sequenced and sized appropriately, not necessarily stopping it all dead in the waters. We should know that for a long time, we always talked about geocapital as somehow an externality, right? It was outside the scope of what was going on. It was something that happened after the fact or otherwise. But that's a very misplaced notion of political economy. It was invented by a guy named Pagoo in the 1920s. In fact, limited air, land, and water supplies are 4 categories of geocapital that every public and private enterprise needs to operate. This is operational, internal operational. You've got to have a place to put your infrastructure. You've got to have a place to supply a material. You've got to have a place to harbor your residuals, and you've got to have a place for safety and security setbacks. So those are quantified amounts of geocapital that are actually required to operate a system. And would you give me just a second, please?
Helen?
So what I invite you all to consider is that geocapital regulations are not really behavior controls. They are zoning laws. We all know that the Clean Water Act made the waters of the United States fishable and swimmable. What are those, right? Use designations. What is zoning? Use designations. Those statutes do a second thing, which is they ration the volumes out of the public trust accounts that an enterprise can actually use. So if you have a Clean Air Act permit, that tells you that you're allowed to use the airspace for a certain amount of residuals that meets the amount of the airspace you're being given in that permit. So 10 tons worth of air. Remember, the pollution is not the value component. The airshed is the value component. The water is the value component. The land is the value component. The contamination is not the value component. It's not what we're measuring. We're measuring the capacity of the asset, the geocapital asset, as a receiving body or carrying capacity to function. So these use limits and rationing already compound what are essentially supply caps that the earth presents itself. You know, there's only so many molecules. It's the law of conservation of matter. We can't make any more. There's no fiat planet. And enterprise reality nowadays is geocapital supply is deficient relative to operational or expansion requirements. We don't have enough air, land, and water to keep doing everything we think we want to do. That's why we're overloading everything. That's why we have non-attainment designations in New York. It's why we have CSO administrative orders. It's why we have sewage backup orders. It's why we have violations, because there are entities systemically using more geocapital capacity than the city has. Okay, now the second problem is what I call the Pink Princess impact analysis. Having an impact on the environment was conceived in 1969. That's when we drafted NEPA to explain air, land, and water overloading and destruction. Now, having an impact on, to me, does not convey overloading and destruction. It just doesn't. You know, it almost sounds like you're hurting the planet's feelings or something. And it's a total misapplication of Pigouvian externalities. Now, development has intensified internal requirements for air and water, as well as land. And we don't have any more to give. So a couple of, you either zero sum and exchange it out, or you relocate. And that's why we got as much offshoring as we have over the last 50 years, because there are many other nations in the world that will let people have their geocapital, have public geocapital to use in their enterprise systems, like Chinese coal plants and the magnets for those lovely windmills going in off New York City are using rare earth metals that are processed in China next to the 5-mile toxic lake, because in China, you're allowed to use the geocapital for the permanent harboring of toxic residuals with very little consequence. So one of the best examples of geocapital zero sum is the recent Bayonne Bridge reconstruction. You may remember that the roadway of the Bayonne Bridge sat here, and ships were traditionally about this tall. But when post-Panamax ships came along and ships became this tall, the roadway was sitting in the airspace assets. So the roadway had to be lifted out of the airspace so the ships could use it. So that was not a construction project. That was an airspace buyback, and it cost $1.4 billion.
Wow.
To buy air, in case anybody tells you air is free. So the hard look at impacts construct, it's just not what we need today. And our rezoning efforts and the EISs associated with those rezonings are proving it. What do we have? We have a systemic practice in New York City where the city and its advocates withhold or misstate the quantified availability of geocapital supply. They misstate the intended use levels, and Alicia uncovered one of the most egregious exercises in that I found in a long time. They mischaracterize public use of public assets when in fact that use is going to inure to the private developers. And they ignore or paper over compliance interference, you know, because if you're going to keep loading 10,000 more people's sewage material into the Gowanus Canal, that's going to interfere with complying with the canal's cleanup requirements that are existent now. And then one of the worst things I see is we get these under the table exchanges. We get these side deals and these promises and these points of agreement, or whatever they're called, where we do these trading in millions of dollars worth of geocapital assets out of the public trust for the cost of an escalator in a subway. And so these are not being adequately registered or priced, and they're being traded away for just minuscule amounts of money or value back to the city, and these are fairly corrupt bargains in my estimation. So, but the reverse is kind of true in that the constrained geocapital supply in New York City is effectively a developer's nightmare. There just isn't enough. I don't know if y'all are familiar, but the Army Corps of Engineers needed to dredge New York Harbor several years ago. They needed to re-dredge all the shipping lanes so that large ships could get in and out. And in order to do that, they were going to put an enormous amount of equipment out into the harbor, pumping and all of that stuff. The Army Corps of Engineers had to start an emissions bank, and they had to buy out the emissions level loading of other users in the New York City area and take the credits and put them in the emissions bank to cover the emissions the Army Corps of Engineers was going to make. Now, I don't hear of developers having to do that. I don't hear of developers having to pay a $25,000 per residence hookup fee like most jurisdictions do in order for you to get access to the water and the sewage carrying capacity. But yet developers can get access to these public trust assets with very little trouble or concern. The finite requirements are all needed by everybody else too. And they, well, we haven't got the right sets of offsets, purchase, or changes in design and scale of operation that should be forced on these developers by virtue of these limitations. And in the Gowanus case I'm working on, they've gone so far as to not even issue a finding statement under the EIS, which is required to say what, if any, so-called mitigation might be done in the way of these kinds of things. So effectively, New York is at a saturation point. We can't make any more greenhouse gases. We're over capacity. We can't make any more emissions. We're over capacity. We're non-attainment. We can't make any more discharges because the water is saturated with contaminants. We can't meet the existing water quality standards, and those use designations just changed, and the water quality standards are going to change. We have impaired water listings on places like the Gowanus and the Newtown Creek. We have uncleaned up Superfund sites, 3 of them listed. One, the Coney Island Creek, has made the list, but has made the hazard ranking threshold, but it has not been listed. So we're flat out of air, land, and water by and large here in New York City, and developers know it, which is why they're circumventing so many of the systems that would reveal it. So, so I'll suggest for the Sierra Club some concepts that I've worked on for many years that I think are the better way to think of geocapital assets in the 21st century. Namely, that the things you see up there on the screen, the air shed capacity to hold residuals, inner or outer space, you know, where can you put physical infrastructure? Where can you put physical satellites or airplanes or ships? Airwaves, how much bandwidth and spectrum do we have? How much water do we have? How much water space do we have? You know, where can ships go or not go? Or animals live or not live? How much absorption capacity, public land, subsurface? These are all in public trust accounts, and they've got to have their highest and best use determined by law. The supplies are valuable public assets, and they can only be used when you've fully complied with due process. Upzoning should trip multiple laws governing these public trust assets and trigger much stricter scrutiny by federal and state overseers. We've been shocked to discover how hard EPA has fought to be considered an involved agency, fought not to be considered, excuse me, an involved agency in the Gowanus. They're supervising a Superfund cleanup. They've got multiple Clean Water Act violations, and they don't think they're an involved agency in the development of 80 blocks of high rises around that canal. It is a stunning abrogation of duty. And perhaps this is the most radical. Trust accounts should be inventoried, appraised, and the contents non-transferable. So in other words, our Mr. Brad Lander, the new comptroller, should have all of the airshed, the airspace, the airwaves, the water supply, the coastline, whatever it may be. That should all be counted, inventoried, and listed in trust accounts. I don't know how many of you have any kind of a trust, but no trustee is allowed to run a trust account without a clear inventory and appraisal. Because if you're running a trust account, you have to assure not only that those assets maintain their value, but in some instances, you're kind of in charge of making sure they grow in value. And so municipals authorities should be educated that they do not control water and air assets. Those are governed by preemptive federal controls. There is no municipal New York authority to give away water carrying capacity. That has to be done through a state or a federal permit. And then make sure that we are never using scarce, rare, precious geocapital trust assets as pot sweeteners in zoning actions. I mean, that's probably one of the most offensive aspects goes on. Do I think that it's okay to use air, land, and water in development? Absolutely. But if you're going to build a 10-story or a 20-story building and you're going to use airspace, then you have to go to the public accounts and buy that airspace for whatever it costs. You have to buy that airshed for whatever it costs. You have to buy that water discharge carrying capacity for whatever the value may be to you and what the going rate is on the markets. So what are we trying to do now when we contest these rezonings and upzonings? Well, one of the things I try to recommend to folks is do not get into these ultra-virus negotiating systems. Do not go to Bridging Gowanus. Do not go to a Gail Brewer community seaport working group. Just don't go. They're traps. You have no leverage. They're not legally governed. They're not part of due process. They're made up. No one is bound by the results. There is no enforcement mechanism for whatever those agreements might be. Just don't go. ULURP does not have binding requirements for anything that comes out of community engagement negotiating. There's nothing. The only place you should go to identify these things is the EIS scoping and the EIS process. That's where there are legal requirements, legal constraints, legal controls on whether and how air, land, and water can get used in zoning action. And I can't say it enough. There is a limited amount of municipal estoppel, but there is really largely no estoppel against the government. If Brad Lander goes out and says, I'm signing an agreement with the mayor and I'm going to have $200 million for the Gowanus houses, and it's all nonsense because the $200 million never existed to begin with, and there's no chance of getting it now. You can't go in and get a writ against Brad Lander to enforce him to get you that $200 million. There's no such thing. It's fantasy. It's made up. And the idea that elected leaders get people to go into these rooms and start, trading 5 floors in buildings for a school. It's crazy. It's just. New to me. And then I encourage everyone to practice what I'll call intersectionality. That if there is a failure to meet a Clean Water Act standard or sewer backup order compliance is not forthcoming, those are valid challenges to an inadequate and compartmentalized idea of a land zoning, because there's nothing you can do on land that does not require air and water too. They're just not separated. It's just not a thing. So there's nothing about land that does not involve water and air. There's nothing about a building that does not involve land and air and water. There's nothing about any enterprise system that does not require geocapital capacity as an operational component. So anything we can do to start demanding a comptroller inventory. I know Lucy knew some people in the former comptroller's office. I ginned up a whole package and explanation and everything. I brought this up years ago with the Brooklyn Library case that was going on over in the elimination of the Brooklyn Heights Library. It didn't go anywhere, but you know, it's like tobacco litigation. You may have to do it 3 times. But we've got to get the comptroller to put these assets on the books, so it's harder to give them away. And most importantly, abandon this idea of separate and unequal status for geocapital and planning systems. We can't have land supremacy anymore. It really doesn't work. Water and air are the things that are harder to get, and your chances of defeating a zoning or constraining a zoning or limiting a zoning because of water and air supply unavailability is much greater than any argument you might have on land or ULO. So as you'll see, I don't believe we should still be using the technology of 1969 now in 2022. We've got to get smarter about how we handle air, land, and water, and notions of having an impact on, while they were important and they brought us a long way, they're not going to do what we need them to do in the coming years now that we've essentially saturated the planet. So thank you all for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Maureen. I saw a couple of questions in the chat, but I also want to welcome Chris Marte, who I believe Maureen worked with in the past.
Oh, yes, of
that
course.
he's on here, our city council member in District 1, who many people who are familiar with, who are on this list here. Catherine, do you want to bring up questions that you see, or I can if you don't? You're muted.
Holly R, last name starts with R, who has a question about the accounts that Maureen was referring to. Holly, let's see if I can find her question. It was about accounts and setting up accounts.
Trust, I'm looking at how can we make these trust accounts happen?
Yes.
This
right.
sounds like a perfect idea, she says.
Oh, thank you. Well, like I say, we have to lobby the comptroller. There's a little bit of an advantage in that we have a comptroller with his sights set on higher office. So he may be amenable to doing things that are consistent with those ambitions. But, you know, it may take a law. It may take some kind of municipal rule in New York City to trigger the requirement to list these assets on New York City's books. We checked at the time we made this argument to the comptroller's office back during the Brooklyn Library case. We did check, and there are fair market value and contracting rules and all kinds of things that are already in place that could help control the expropriation or improper appropriation of these assets in development cases. But then the real trick is to get a rule, I guess, to say that these are the assets themselves. And that takes a mindset change, because like I say, the environment is a very different notion than the molecules making up a defined quantity of asset.
Lucy, Roger has a question and is asking if Maureen could speak a bit about the Article 78 lawsuit against the Governor's Island rezoning. Where are we? What are its chances of defeating that?
I'm not directly familiar with that case. I do know that we have brought up Governor's Island quite a bit in the Gowanus case, because Governor's Island, Gowanus, downtown Brooklyn, Atlantic Yards, all feed into a single wastewater treatment plant, one of the smallest ones in the entire New York City sewage system. It's only 60 million gallons a day. And so we've been arguing that the analyses in these EISs are inadequate because they do not assess wet weather and the loading that goes into these sewage systems in wet weather. And of course, now we just so tragically know the loading that can kill people in wet weather in New York. I believe Richard Lippis is also working on that case, and they have updated their filing. I don't know if anybody else maybe knows that, anything about that.
Sorry, Maureen, Roger's question was actually about the sewer line permit. He asked, where on the web can one find permits for sewer line construction? They are installing 36-inch pipes, etc., on Governor's Island. So Roger Manning is the one involved in the Governor's Island lawsuit.
Hello, Roger.
No,
I
Roger.
believe that DEP has to puts filings on its website regarding when it's going to do construction for particular pipes. But the issue to me is not whether they're building a pipe. The issue is how much are they going to load into the wastewater treatment plant? And when the treatment plant can't handle it anymore, how much is going to back up through the CSOs and go into the waters of New York? Because the water is the asset, right? So we tend to look at these issues not as whether there's a pipe being built or the size of the pipe, not the physical infrastructure. What is it going to use by way of, the more natural infrastructure, the geocapital capacities, because there is no capacity left in the canal, in Newtown Creek, in the East River, in the Hudson River. There's no more capacity to take toxic sewage or toxic outfalls.
All right. Bonnie has a question. She says, how do you get the assets on the books?
Well, like I say, you start a movement.
Right.
Folks like you guys are so, you have this down pat in a way. That's why I'm encouraging you to think of this as a bit of a pivot, to say that, virtue and greenness and those sorts of things are all good. But at the end of the day, if we're not tracking the molecules, we're not doing it. And so, yeah, let's start asking for it. Let's see about drafting legislation. Let's take it to some of our supporters. Maybe Mr. Marte would like to think about doing this. I know what a leader he has been in so many ways. And I know we've chatted a little bit about this in the past, but if there's a little more consensus and we can broaden the movement, it may be the kind of thing we can take up. I do believe this is a really good way for the Sierra Club to be involved, I think, in the more urban type issues. This really is consistent with the kind of goals and mission statements that Sierra Club would have, but in an urban environment. We don't hesitate to count acres or gallons in water supplies out west, or gallons in the aquifer and that sort of thing. So this is comparable.
Thank you. I was going to suggest that perhaps Chris and Maureen could
Lucy?
speak sometime further. I know you know each other from the past, and so happy to have Chris here. Sorry, Catherine, you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm making Chris a panelist because I thought he might want to directly ask Maureen a question.
I see that.
So let me see. I just had him and clicked make a panelist, but I don't think he's been made a panelist yet. So I have to.
I see him up there, but he is muted and
Hey everyone.
There he is.
Uh,
Yay.
yeah, thank you for that presentation, Maureen. It's really great. I actually just texted my chief of staff to see if we could look into the trust idea. So no questions for me, but just thank you for a fascinating.
Oh, please, and don't
presentation.
hesitate to call. We can chat more about it. See
Sounds
how
great.
we can channel that into some legislation, maybe.
Definitely.
Can I follow up with a quick question? Lucy, is that okay?
of course.
What would go into putting these in the trust? What would be involved? Like what might be the roadblocks to accomplishing that? And what can we do to enable that to happen, if anything?
Sure. Well, there are probably, the idea of public trust has had very narrow interpretation, which I'm not sure I understand for the last many years. So public trust assets are often the land underneath water when the water recedes, under tidal areas. Those are public trust assets along coastlines and that sort of thing. Sometimes aquifers are considered public waters of the state, you know, the groundwater supplies and that sort of thing. Some water supplies are in this realm. But I think it's time to just take all aspects of air and land and water. You've heard me mention that there are multiple subsets. So the air waves are in effect already in a public trust. They're governed by international treaty, and they are only allocated by government entities. So they're kind of listed, but we don't really treat them as assets. You know, we don't give them value. When I worked for the Air Force, if we put a building up, we assigned it a plant replacement value, right? That was what it would cost us to build the building again if it fell down. So it was on the books for plant replacement value. And then we voluntarily spent money on it every year on a recapitalization program to maintain it, so that at the end of, say, 60 or 70 years, the building was as good as it was when it was new. That's what we do with buildings. And I just couldn't believe we didn't have the same system for a planet, for the natural assets, because we can't replace those. So why do we have to wait for the EPA to yell at us, for goodness sakes? What are we, 12, and we have to have curfews? You know, we're all grown-ups. Well, if we don't put these on the books as assets and take care of them because they are operationally necessary for whatever your enterprise system has to do, then it's crazy. So assessing the plant replacement value for these things, you know, getting some preliminary inventories, getting some pilot programs together, figuring out what the airshed capacity is. You know, it can be done. We know it.
Yeah.
And then just measuring it and asking for it to be put in the books. Yes, Luce.
I hate to stop this because I know we could go on for another hour, but we
Sure.
need to move along. And that was the purpose of having the post-webinar Zoom. So we
Yeah.
can't continue. I'm sorry. I know there's more questions.
And I will be happy to tune in.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Yes,
Great
thank
questions.
you, Maureen, so much. And I'm sorry for those questions that are there. I see them, but we'll have to come back to that later because I so want to hear from Professor Ngadi and ALICIA Boyd. If you're ready, I'd love for you to jump in here.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you, Maureen. You gave me an opener, which is about the trust. The problem goes back to 250 years ago when the Constitution established the right of private property as sacrosanct. And the courts and the states have reinforced and supported that. I do believe expansion of the public trust, strengthening of the public trust is essential. But we have to dig deep to change these things. This New York City began as a colony on land that was taken from the Lenape, and private property replaced it, and that became sacrosanct. I don't want to go into the theory and the history, but it has a lot to do with what I'm going to say about zoning. Zoning was established in New York City in 1916. It was the first major city in the country to have zoning. But zoning was established to avoid planning and to protect the expansion of private property beyond Lower Manhattan, beyond the then existing urbanized portion of Manhattan. Keep that in mind. Zoning was to avoid planning. There was a big debate after the construction of Central Park about planning versus zoning, and planning lost. Planning lost, zoning won. Why? Because the businesses in the highest value, on the highest valued land in Lower Manhattan of that time, wanted to use zoning to reinforce the value of their properties by preventing industry and immigrant housing, lower income housing, working class housing, from developing next to their high valued properties. So zoning was exclusionary right from the start. And that's the philosophy that the city planning department has followed consistently, which is not what we need to include. That is not what the city needs in the long-term future, but how is it going to grow consistent with the developers and the development of a land market. The first plan, so-called plan in New York City, which is honored in all the planning books, was the grid plan for Lower Manhattan. That's not a plan. That's a subdivision. It's a subdivision of land for private development. That is the philosophy that's ruled ever since. Zoning to avoid planning, not zoning as a way of projecting the best quality human environment in the long-term future. And I say this because today we hear, when I worked at city planning department, by the way, I used to hear all the time, there was a nucleus of us in the city planning department said, race matters. You realize you're using zoning as an exclusionary tool. And they say, oh no, zoning is a racially neutral. Well, I'm happy to say the city planning department has finally recognized that zoning does matter, but they got it all backwards. They think it matters, because all you have to do is jiggle the regulations, and you have to get any racist thoughts out of your head. And that both of those things are irrelevant. And I wanted to say that's the second point that I wanted to make was zoning has been racially exclusive right from the start, based on class and race. It was a way of calming down the tenant organizing in the early part of the 20th century. And in the post-war period, post-Second World War period, it was a powerful tool to redevelop large parts of Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn and the other boroughs. And it was used, the planning by the city was used as an instrument in the urban renewal program. Urban renewal was a federal program. The city and the state used federal money in order to displace largely communities of color, Black and brown communities, in order to redevelop the land that was potentially of the highest price. And the other point I want to make is that the fights against zoning were directly linked with the rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. The urban renewal fights were against the displacement of communities of color, and they led to, this is a point that's often missed in telling the history. They led to the establishment of community boards. Now we know community boards have very little power, but there was a demand that communities have a role in planning, because prior to that, they had no role. It was all done by a powerful mayor's office, the Board of Estimate, then a powerful mayor, controlled land use throughout the city. communities had no formal role in the process. And a lot of activists fought for this all over the city. And it wasn't just in the civil rights movement, but it was a powerful element that led to the creation of community boards in 1975. The next step was 1990, when the city charter was again revised to permit community boards to do community plans, and allowed the city planning department to adopt the plans as officially adopted community plans under section 197A of the city charter. So they were called 197A plans. Now, I spent a couple of decades of my professional career working on 197A plans, advising 197A plans, because I believe in community-based planning. I believe the planning done in City Hall was always blind to the variety of needs that people have in the places where they live and work. And community planning was a potential answer. Well, I can say that after 15 years, I came to the conclusion that this, and I worked on several of these plans as a planner. I came to the conclusion that they were a waste of time. So today, when people come ask me, would you help us do a community plan, a 197A plan? I say, no, don't waste your time. They let you do the plan. They run you through the ringer. They question everything you do. They diminish its value and content, and then they throw it away. So again, zoning is the game, not planning. And the city planning department, the mayor's office, who's the strongest element in planning policy, supports this. Now, I want to end up talking about, I want to say one more thing. Housing. Zoning has been advanced now as the solution to the housing shortage and the housing problem. Inclusion, if zoning was exclusionary based on race and class and income, the theory is that now zoning can be inclusionary. And in theory, that's true, it can be. But inclusionary zoning has always been used as a tool for enhancing developer profits, period. Bill de Blasio was the wisest of them all and instituted mandatory inclusionary housing as a requirement in all rezonings going on in the city. Bloomberg rezoned 40% of the city, and there was some inclusionary housing thrown in to placate communities that were organizing against rezonings. But de Blasio thought he was clever. He was going to mandate it so that zoning would be inclusionary. Not so. First of all, the mandatory inclusionary housing, MIH, requires that as little as 20% of the housing be affordable to people with low and moderate incomes. However, affordability is based on area-wide median income, which includes portions of the wealthier suburbs. And you can have now affordable housing for households making beyond $140,000 a year. Not affordable. And then Mr. de Blasio thought he was going to be clever because he believes in social justice. Haha. And he said, well, Bloomberg rezoned 40% of the city. I'm going to focus on my neighborhoods, communities of color, low-income communities, because they're the ones who need development the most. They've been ignored. Bloomberg overlooked them. Yeah, well, almost every one of de Blasio's rezonings was contested heavily by the residents. And he was going to do 15. He wound up actually getting, I think, 6 or 7, something like that. And then we also know that the vast majority of the so-called inclusionary housing in the mayor's housing plan did not come from rezonings. It came from separate expenditures through subsidies going to the HPD, the Housing Preservation and Development Department. So I guess I want to wind up, because this is all, it's all about land. And I think the fundamental problem is, and here I would phrase it differently than Maureen. The problem is that land is an asset. The problem is that land should be a public good, and it should not be sold to anybody. And it should not be put on the market. It should not be valued as equivalent to greater than or cheaper than privately owned land, because in the marketplace and following the Constitution, private land ownership is always going to win. So I think we have to go back to our precursors, the Lenape, and think about how they understood land. They had, by the way, the great myth is, of course, that the Dutch bought Manhattan from the Indians. Well, the Indians didn't know money. That's a fairy tale. The Indians had no exchange. Land wasn't, there was no exchange value to land. It was a use value. And I think we have to get back there and think about all of the other natural resources. We're facing a catastrophe in sea level rise and climate change. It's coming. And the New York City administrations have answered this by setting up special offices in the mayor's office to study and to produce reports. And they have done very little, except thinking about building a few barriers that may destroy more land than they can actually save in the long run. And it's probably going to be too little, too late. Instead, what we have watched, what we have seen in the last 2 decades, the Bloomberg administration particularly, and the de Blasio administration, has been a building spree on land that is flood prone. Why? Because New York City has refused to accept a redrawing of the floodplain by feds, which would make it financially impossible to build as has been built in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, on the waterfront, in the Bronx, and so the other thing I just have to end with is, I know Chris knows about this, the racial impact study. Now, thanks to the organizing by a lot of great people who have opposed rezoning in their neighborhoods, in communities of color, the city has finally accepted the idea that race may have something to do with the zoning patterns. So what did they do? They followed the horrible precedent of the environmental impact statement, which is just really churned out by a lot of high-paid consultants in order to rationalize land use decisions that were already made. And they created the obligation for a racial impact study. Now, in theory, there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with understanding that race matters. Maybe that's after a century, maybe that's progress for the city planning department. But the racial impact statement is as irrelevant as the environmental impact statement, as long as it's only produced as a throwaway, something to be filed, and then to allow developers to have their way. And developers want their way now because building on the waterfront, despite the inevitability that the land is going to be flooded in 20 or 30 years, doesn't make any difference, because the latest high-rise and high-valued real estate being built in New York City, they're nothing more than vertical cash registers. Millionaires Row, you have vacancy 35%. They're investment vehicles. They're not used for habitation. So where are the planners? Where were they when these decisions were made about zoning on the waterfront? And why are they waking up now to the fact that sea level could rise? We knew this years ago and did nothing, and we're still doing nothing. So zoning is a weak tool. Don't expect the zoning to solve the problem of climate change and sea level rise. And don't expect zoning to deal with the inequities. I get people calling me all the time and saying, well, what do we do? We're being forced out of our homes. We're getting rezoned. They want to put in this and that. There are really only three things you can do. And I think Alicia is going to talk about those. Organize, organize, and organize.
Thank you, Tom. I was wanting you to speak a little bit about 421A and if you can for a minute, and how developers use the system to spend our tax dollars, basically, for their profits.
Yeah, good point. I skipped over that. In 421A allows developers to get tax write-offs for constructing new housing. This was a product of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, when it became the mantra of both Democrats and Republicans in government that the city could do nothing except, and therefore had to turn to the private sector for the answers to all the questions. And the biggest answer they saw was real estate development, because, of course, the real estate industry is the largest contributor to all of their campaigns. And so 421A is a tax write-off, a tax subsidy, basically, for new development, based on the theory that new development is good. And this is basically simple market economics. If you have more housing, it'll lower the price of housing. It'll keep rents low. Well, study the trends over the last 50 years since the fiscal crisis. Rents have shot way up. House prices have gone way up, and new development keeps getting subsidized. Supply does not meet demand. That's not the way the local property market works. Actually, I took a real estate course once, and the basic principle that you see from all of the real estate experts is there are three principles: location, location, location. So the highest values are in the centrally located areas. And that's how zoning works too. The highest values increase the potential for new market rate development. And the 421A was also coinciding with the withdrawal of public funds from public housing and from other subsidies of affordable housing. And so the two go hand in hand. It's time to eliminate 421A. Billions of dollars of subsidies have gone to real estate developers. Tax write-offs, taxes that are needed in order to provide in the public realm for schools, libraries, all of the other things that are lacking in New York City. And these subsidies are, and you know, the truth that doesn't often get transmitted is actually real estate is a major contributor to the tax base of New York City, but it's commercial real estate. It's not housing. Housing is not a major contributor. And so, and it's federal and state government as well. So that's it. And I think
Yeah, thank
these
you.
are these are things that have really got to be taken up by grassroots citizen groups and pushed to the fore of the political agenda. Not doing racial impact studies that come after the fact and don't really influence policy.
So thank you so much, Tom. We could go on again for a very long time. I see some questions and comments in here, but I think we need to save them for later in the interest of time, because really want Alicia to talk about her success and experience. A lot of us are so familiar with Alicia and her achievements as her own lawyer, her pro se lawyer. And so Alicia, why don't you take it over now if you're ready?
Yes,
Thank you,
first I just
Tom.
want to say I was watching the attendees, and there's so many people that I've worked with, and it's so nice to see you guys. I mean, it's really nice as a political activist to get involved in other people's struggles, and it's nice. And I just want to say a shout out to everyone. I want to just kind of piggyback on both Maureen and Tom's introduction, because they're giving you a much broader view, and mine is a very narrow view that kind of puts this all into context when we actually fight a particular issue in a particular community. And just speaking on Tom's issue, he was talking about how planning, zoning was really an exclusionary. And that's exactly how it happened in my community. We had this Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, and they had seen this tower, this Tivoli Tower that was for low or moderate income residents. And they didn't want any more of that. So they created zoning. And they had the first height limits in the city that then said, oh no, we see development potential all along the perimeter of the garden, and we do not want another Tivoli Towers. So we need to protect it. And so it was exclusionary. They wanted to make sure that there were no more of these low, moderate income community housing, because at the time, nobody wanted to live in Crown Heights except Black folks. So they introduced it in 1991. They put the height limits in, but then, things changed. And all of a sudden it became valuable to be next to water or parks. And so the value changed. So now developers wanted to come into the community, but then they had these height restrictions. So the way that they got around that was, let's create a plan. So, so the plan was, we wasn't doing zoning, we're doing planning. So let's all get together as a community and let's plan what it is that you want. However, the community, and we just thank Tom Magatti so much for this, because he was essential in this. the community organized and realized that DCP was really pulling our legs, because all of the sessions that you go to, all the promises that they make was all lies. Because once they get their hands on a rezoning application, your voice in the community becomes powerless and you have no power to change anything. And I always described it as Dracula. I always described DCP as Dracula, you know? They always say that Dracula, if you let Dracula in, then you're powerless. So the idea is never let Dracula into your house. Like if you willingly let him in, then all of a sudden, you know, you're gonna be powerless. Well, that's DCP. And so our strategy as a community was, don't let him in. We don't want to have any discussions. We don't want to sit at any tables, because why would you want to sit at a table where you're powerless? So we fought a rezoning, a district-wide rezoning that was supposed to be a plan, but we knew that the plan was just upzoning. We knew that the plan was going to be just whatever the developers wanted, because we had no power in that spot, in that process, except for allowing them to come in, because once they came in, then we were powerless. And we knew what they were targeting. We knew they were targeting along the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, because now it became valuable real estate. Now that they didn't want the protections. Now they wanted to build high, but they wanted to build luxury high. And at the same time caused a massive amount of displacement, because they knew that that's what's going to happen. When you bring luxury development into a low to moderate income community, you're going to cause displacement. You know, that's just a reality that we all know. So we fought it, and we stopped it. We didn't let them into the door. We didn't let them into the door. We got arrested, and we got called a couple of names, and we did organize. Tom told us that right from the beginning, like organize, knock on the doors. And that's what we did. So then the developers couldn't do a district-wide rezoning. So they had to go individually, take their projects individually. One individual projects a little bit weaker than a district-wide rezoning. They're much more vulnerable, but they tried so many different ways to get a district-wide rezoning, and that they said, okay, we'll go on our own. So the first one, so they devised a plan. And so this was their plan. They wanted to have buildings all along the corridor of the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, and they wanted to go up about 50 stories, but they knew no way in hell were they going to be able to do that all at once. So they said, okay, let's split the land, and let's let a smaller development project actually break everything, break the community plan, break the height limits, do 3 hours of shadows, and let's win on that. So that's what they did. They took the small plan, it was done by Cornell. And, our elected official, Lori Cumbo, we call her Lion Lori, that was her name for us in the community, came and, I like this plan, I got this wonderful community benefits agreement. They're gonna give us all this affordable housing, because again, now, yes, it became the way to get affordable housing. And so what they did is they took all this money and lobbied DCP, the Department of City Planning, so that they could avoid what Maureen was talking about. That is looking at the assets, looking at the impacts of this development, these development projects. So they spent over $700,000 lobbying DCP, and 250 of that, one person, and that was the plan, Kevin Coates. Kevin Kraft, he was the planner. They lobbied him almost $250,000. And what he did, he shaded the numbers. What DCP is supposed to do, DCP is supposed to make sure that any development project adheres to all the environmental rules. That if they are going to build a certain amount, then they have to look at water and sewage impacts. They have to look at, what this is going to happen, what's going to happen to the community, what's going to happen to our water, what's going to happen to our air, what's going to happen to it. But really what DCP is, DCP is a way in which developers go to them and they figure out how to fudge the numbers so they don't have to look at them. That's the key for DCP. DCP gets the lobbying, and they really, I don't know why they allowed a city planner to be lobbied, $250,000. So he told them, oh, you don't have to look at water and sewage impacts. And let me tell you how to do it. You're supposed to, if you build more than 400 additional units, you have to look at water and sewage impacts. So why don't we say you're only going to build 250? But how can you do that? Well, they said, what you can do is you can fudge the numbers and say you're going to build large apartments, because the larger the apartment, the smaller number of apartments. So if you have, a 680 square foot apartment and you have 1,000 square foot apartment, you're going to get less apartments if you go bigger, of course, because it's just a matter of space. So instead of using 680 square feet as your average apartment, they decided they're going to say 1,000 square feet was their average apartment. So they were only going to build 253 apartments. But if they use the 680 square feet, which is what they can do, they would have gotten 517 and been way over the limit. So they said, yes, we're going to use, our average apartment is going to be 1,000. But then when you looked into the record, they didn't even have one apartment that was over 950 square feet. So how can you have the average square feet of your apartment 1,000? You don't even got any that is over that or even meet that. It was the largest apartment was 950. They didn't care. They didn't care. They just said, yes, 1,000. Check, you don't have to look at the water and sewage impacts. This is going through, we're not doing environmental assessment statement. An environmental impact statement. There would be no adverse effects. And they just push it right through. And that's what they did. They just pushed it right through. And we went through the EULA process. We didn't really even organize around the EULA process. I'm gonna tell you that. Some people spend a lot of energy bringing all these people to the EULA process. We did not. We were a few of us there. We put some comments on, because we know once you certify an application, it's done, people. It's done. They might tweak a little bit here, take off a floor. Oh yeah, we'll take off 2 floors. Oh, we compromised with the community. We gave them 2 extra apartments. I mean, really, we don't even bother. But we were preparing for a lawsuit. And that's what we did. We spent that time preparing, because once the application is certified, it is done. It is done. It has a 99% chance of being. So that's what we did. And when we went to court, we were pro se litigants, right? I had a little team. I can't say it was all me. We had a team. We had about 10 of us, and we were meeting every week. We were looking over everything. We filed the papers. And then when the attorney, first they found all female attorneys. This was the strategy. Oh, it's a public relations thing. We want to make sure, it's women, because they knew I was a woman. So they found all the females that they could find. There was no black one. They didn't have none on their payroll. So they just found the woman. And the woman, the first woman showed up and she said, oh, this is going to be fast. Pro se, oh, we're going to be finished with this case so fast. It's unbelievable. So she came in saying that she was a developer, and yes, they, da. And then after looking at the paperwork, they changed their mind. They said, oh, we're not the developers. We don't have anything to do with that application. We're not the developers. What are you talking about? Yes, our name is on all the applications. Yes, we did show up at all the hearings. Yes, we do own the property there, but we don't have nothing to do with it now. It's not our application. It's not, and this is the argument that they ran through the court. So we organizing. This is when you organize. This is when you get people to come out during court, because they're judges there, and judges got to get reelected. So when we packed that house, that courtroom, every time, we had a packed courtroom every time. And there's a lot of people here that were part of that packing, and they saw all, and it was exciting because you had these pro se litigants, 3 of us, against the city and against the developers. So they tried a couple of maneuvers. They tried to circumvent the temporary restraining order that we got so they wouldn't build. And then when that failed and the judge came in and put a new temporary restraining order, then they said, okay, we had enough of these people. Then it was in December, there we were, and then like 15 lawyers showed up. Now these are all the males, all the white males. Every last one of them were white males. They would come like, oh, we're here. And one, what's his name? Robert Lobel said, oh, this is gonna be so much fun. He said, oh, we're gonna destroy them. And so there we were, the 3 pro se litigants sitting on the table, and there was 15 lawyers. They were stumbling over themselves, couldn't find seats, had to go into the subsequent bench because they were just all over it, because they were showing their might, that they were gonna come here and they were gonna put us in our place. And, you know, we had enough of those people. And so long story short, yeah, we won that. We won it in the lower court. We won it in the lower court. But then don't forget, the big development project was coming behind it. That was the 50-story building that they wanted to build. They already got the first rezoning. It was being challenged in the courts, but they had gotten it passed. So now they were coming through because the smaller development was paving the way for the bigger development. So they came in, you know, they were about to certify, but there was a new charter revision in 2019. And that charter division had one condition, and that was before you certify an application, you have to let the community know 30 days before. And this was a new condition because a lot of people have been complaining that once an application is certified, you really can't change it. And it was true. Once an application is certified, it's done, people. Forget it. You're not changing it. So it got changed. And this was pushed by Gail Brewer from the borough president. In Manhattan, the former borough president. So anyway, we found out, we filed the lawsuit. We did a FOIL. And sometimes you get friends, if freedom of information. And we found a memo. And the memo said that the development project, 50 stories, 4.5 hours of shadows, was going to have a negative impact on the garden. Now, DCP had that memo, but they still stated that no negative impact was going to happen with the memo. This is the memo from the Parks Department. They said, oh, nothing is going to happen to the BBG. Oh, don't even worry about it. Yeah, so the desert collection has to be moved and shut down, but that's not a negative effect. I don't really know what they mean by what was a negative effect, but that's what they're saying. So they were about to certify the application and say no negative effect. But then after we had just beat the city and all these developers and 25 lawyers showing up, the city said, wait a minute, we filed the lawsuit before they certified the application. The city said, let me look at this lawsuit because we have just been through the ringer with what you guys did and we do not want to repeat because y'all say whatever y'all want to say. Them pro se litigants, they're tough. That community is tough. So they looked at it, and this is my belief. I don't have any proof, but it's my belief that the city lawyers looked at the Department of City Planning's rezoning application and saw that they were going to say that no adverse effects were going to happen when you have a government entity, a city saying that it would. They knew that they would lose in court. And they did not want that. So they changed their mind and said, yes, negative effects will happen to the department, would happen to BBG. And then they certified the application with the big to-do-ha that, oh, this is so horrible. They were, it's just a horrible thing that, the developer would try to do something like this to the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens. Oh, but we're going to certify it, but please let them know that this is not going to happen. And so they certified the application, making it the second application that's ever been certified that did not finish the EULA process because the Department of City Planning Commission, the City Planning Commission did not approve it. It's a rare thing. But that was because of the diligence of the community. It was the diligence of the residents showing up at the first court hearing, making sure that went correctly. And then, of course, my team filing that new lawsuit. Of course, we didn't get credit for it. You know, Benepy from the Brooklyn, you know, the BBG got credited for organizing against the development project, and you know, and it was okay. I'm just like, okay, it's okay. You know, fine. You can't say a Black woman in the Black community beat you guys. You know, it's a rarity. No, we know it does not fit well. So you have to sit there and say somebody else did it. Fine, go ahead and do that. But what we were happy about was that we won that. We won that. So they never certified, they certified the application, but it never finished through the EULA process because the City Planning Commission voted it down. And I do believe, and this is again, not anything that I have in facts, but I do believe what happened is once the city recognized and stated on the record that no negative effects would happen, that negative effects would happen because of the lawsuit that we filed, I believe that's when BBG's board finally agreed that the project needed to be nixed. Because up until that point, there were so many key members of BBG board that's a part of development, the lawyers, developers, you know, banks, that I know that they wanted that project. But once it was very clear and they couldn't hide behind, you know, the city saying, oh, no negative effects, then they niched it and they said, no. It cannot happen. And so it did not happen. Now, updating right now, that lawsuit that we won in the lower court, it's now in the second department. And we're still fighting that. We're still responding. When we get an opportunity to fully complete it and we get to have oral arguments, we'll definitely let everybody know, because obviously we would like the lower court's findings to be supported. And that's it.
Fantastic, Alicia. You know, everyone has such admiration and respect for you. As Sandy said in the chat, anyone fortunate enough to have attended these court hearings and seeing Alicia in action were blessed. She knocked every one of those 15 attorneys on their misbegotten butts. Yeah, and I was there. A lot of the people on this call were there. And yes, it was delightful to see Alicia. I mean, delightful to see Alicia win and do so well, but horrific to see what she was up against. But she stood up. She slayed the dragon, or Dracula, as the case may be. In this. It was fantastic.
Well, I always want to just let everybody know it was a team. I mean, I was like the head, but there were many people working tirelessly, doing all kinds of legal. We had a legal firm that nobody got paid for. And we did our due diligence, and it was just amazing. It was really a community spirit, you know. It was a community effort, and I just been blessed. I said a joke. I'm gonna tell you the joke. If I had friends the way that I had husbands, I wouldn't have so many husbands.
What?
Because my friends have been so great.
Right.
I wouldn't have had 3 husbands. You know, I know it's a joke that I had.
Well, you know,
Lucy, that group has been.
I need to follow up real quick though, because a couple of things. First of all, Alicia just described 2 cases. She won the first one on water and the second one on air. And so, sorry, Tom, it's not about land. The other thing I want to point out is that there is an old notion called a Curtius maxim, and that is when you own land, you own ad coelos ad infernos. You own it up to the sky and down to the earth's core. That maxim was invented in the 13th century in Italy. It was captured in some Blackstone commentaries, and it hasn't been true for about 300 years. If you own the surface land, and some surface land is in private property status, and it is subject to constitutional protections in terms of whether it can be taken by the state, that's really the only constitutional element of private property, is whether the state can commandeer it from you. But nobody owns the airshed, nobody owns the airspace except to the extent that a municipal system allocates some amount of airspace in connection with surface land into which you may emplace a building. Nobody owns the airwaves. They are assigned to you by the international radio system through the FCC here in America.
Real estate is
Very few people own
going for air rights.
groundwater anymore. Pardon?
But real
Yes,
estate
there is some amount of
is going for
airspace.
air
Yes.
rights.
Tiny
They
little
want
itty
to,
bitty piece. Yeah.
they want
But
to
Tom,
value air
you can't
rights.
own it over the streets. You can't own it over the water. You can't own it over up in the upper sky. The amount of airspace that's actually attached to land and held in some private system of ownership is minuscule. And it's the air shed that's the issue, not the
No,
airspace.
the problem
Those are two
is,
different things.
the problem is if you have freedom to use your land however you want, and despite city regulations, state regulations, federal regulations, you also have freedom to pollute as you wish.
This is, now you see, this is where I think you've got it wrong. And I think
In
it's important to
practice,
point out that
I'm talking in theory.
your
I'm talking
entire
about
discussion
practice.
of zoning stopped in the 1960s. You took us from 1916 up to the 1960s and urban renewal. But all of these laws we're talking about began to be passed in 69, 70, 75, 80s, and 90s. So the entire public approach to whether and when you can use public air and public water has massively altered in the time since you're talking about when zoning came along. We no longer have ad pueblos, ad infernos. If you buy a piece of land, you may not get the mineral rights. You don't get the water rights. You don't get the airspace rights. And you definitely don't get the airshed anymore.
I don't
That was
disagree
all
with you,
preemptively
but that's
taken
not
by the
what-
federal
that's not
government.
Going to stop.
That's the whole
Can I
point.
interrupt you guys? Hello, hello.
Well, no, I
Because
just
know
want to
this-
make one more quick point, and that is if people who are fighting this fight and organizing, it's really a bit of an oar in the water to have everybody say EISs are irrelevant. Because Alicia won her cases because she didn't treat the EISs as irrelevant.
Well,
So
yes.
I think it would be a good idea for us to come to some understanding that in 2022, there may be other ways to do these things, and we do not have to continue to repeat the beliefs of the past like EIS irrelevancy. I think it's very problematic.
We disagree on that because I have spent decades trying to work through to get justice through EIS court cases. Excuse me. It's not going to
Yeah, I
happen.
understand. And I've spent decades doing EISs myself. And the trick is to be persistent and get the rules to change. Now, the fact that we
The
have
power is not
corruption in New
aligned
York,
with
the
us.
fact that we have corruption is not the same as saying the laws are irrelevant.
Well, can I just interject and say that the problem with the EISs or the environmental review and the way that we've been able to, fight them, the problem with it is just disclosure. That's all it is. It's just a disclosure. These are just disclosure laws. As long as you disclose the negative impact, you can go ahead and build.
Mhm.
It's the public pressure when you do disclose that then stops the project, but the law itself does not stop the project.
But I
clearly-
will say this, Alicia, if you disclose activities that will break one of the substantive laws,
Yes,
then you do stop the project.
Right, but I know that in our case, it didn't stop, but the disclosure stopped because of the political outcry, because people were not tolerating you building and destroying a public garden. They just was
So you
not.
got them on both. First, you got them because they didn't disclose. Then you got them when they did.
Right.
So you got them both ways. You got one of each.
Yes,
Number
we
one,
did.
and number
did.
two,
So
I
it-
agree with you.
But
You don't
but what
break
would have
secret.
happened if they had done the right thing the first one, we would have lost.
But if your disclosure under secret, it tells you that you're going to break one of the substantive laws, then you still have another crack at the apple. It
Well,
doesn't break secret.
Maureen, if
But
we were
it
in
breaks
California, I would agree with you. New York is so much the real estate capital of the world that its performance on environmental analysis and impact and action has been terrible
Okay, so
right from the
change it.
start. Why? Because
So
real estate
change it.
moved. Because the
change
real
it.
estate industry buys the politicians, and the real estate industry
I know.
installs the judges, and and California has a much different practice. And if we were there, Oregon, I would say, you know, you got a point. But this is New York City. It's the real estate capital of the world.
Well, I'm not giving up. What is it Lady Violet used to say to Edith? Don't be defeatist, darling. It's so middle class.
I'm not a defeatist. I've been fighting it for 5 decades. So you have to be realistic. You have to understand.
I understand.
your
I understand
tactics-
it's 2022.
If your tactics are only doing Article 78 lawsuits, then
Who said that?
politically, it's.
Who
it's-
said that? Who said that?
Mhm.
No, that's what we collectively have done.
Well, we've got some
Relied
plenty of
on
other things in the
suing
works. Don't
after the
worry
fact.
about it. We've got
You know,
plenty of other things. in the
I
works.
do believe that we do have to change the laws. I mean, we have to get there and make stronger environmental protection laws. I love the idea of, you know, not only having trust, but, you know, putting laws that you can't sell that trust. Or, you know, putting laws that if something is going to damage something, then it cannot happen. Why is, you know, the EIS just a disclosure law? It should be an enforcement law. It should be a protection law. It should say, if you are going to do this to the water, you can't build. If you're going to do this to green space, you cannot build. And we don't have that. But they always bring up, oh, but we're going to do an environmental review. We're going to do an environmental review,
Right.
as if to tell the public that that environmental review is going to stop a project, when it doesn't. It has to be public outcry that stops
If
a
we had
project.
planning and there was a plan that ruled over the zoning, might be a different thing. And actually, New York City is the only major city in the country that has never had a comprehensive plan, a long-term plan. That's an indicator, not saying that the planning is the solution or it will be the solution, but it's an indicator of where we are stacked on, you know, on the spectrum of public interest over the public realm. I mean, New York is really behind. Why? Because of the power of real estate. Unless you confront that power directly, it's not going to go away.
So
Well, you know, I'm an
add-
Incheon girl, Tom. I believe everybody in the boats were going around. You know, I don't sit on the bottom of the Korean Peninsula and think I'm going to drive through the Chinese army. Everybody in the boats were going around. There's lots of ways to do these things. You know, confronting the real estate industry is the last thing I think you do. I think you mess them up by taking away the water and the air, which you can do because they're federally controlled. But, you know, that would take, you know, you gotta try to think out of the box. You're right. I don't want to keep bringing Article 78s over and over and over again. There's more than one way to skin this, but we've also sat idly by and let them get away with abusing the air and the water and taking it for these developments without a peep for a long time. So they've got some bad habits because, you know, I can't tell you how many guys who, you know, in your situation have walked around going, EISs are irrelevant. Michael D. White tells me EISs are irrelevant down in the seaport when at a meeting. Michael Kramer always told me at the seaport meetings, oh, EISs are irrelevant. Well, okay. And guess where the victories come when we go in the EIS. We knew at Two Bridges, we had 4 counts.
I don't disagree with you, but we haven't
won-
had enough victories.
Well,
We need
but-
more victories, and they
Sure.
have to be bigger
and
ones.
we'll keep at them. We'll keep at them.
And if all we can do is sue after the fact, as the progress in this city and throughout its history has been from citizen organizing from neighborhood organizing, and
from laws.
and challenging the power of real estate and big interests. And that's where the progress has come from. That's where all the progressive reform laws that we tout came from.
Laws, yes, laws.
Protecting workers from industries that,
Mhm.
the shirtwaist factory fire was and the organizing after that was a tremendous leap forward. But why? It's because people organized.
Yes.
And
And
they
got
insisted-
laws. And got laws.
Got laws. Can we take this over? I think this could go on for a really long time. We talked about continuing on a Zoom so we could bring in more participants if people are still interested in that. And Alan Gerson kindly put a Zoom link in the chat. If you go up a bit, you will see it on the bottom. And I think if we just click on that, the Zoom will magically appear. And then I think, Alan, I hope you're still there. You can let the attendees in. Should we do that? I'm trying to be democratic here, but small d. If we are ready to end this webinar and move over to the Zoom, can we, so that other people can participate and ask more questions? Because there are a number of questions in this chat that we really didn't get to, and I'd like people to be able to participate more. As much as we could debate this probably for a couple of days. But Catherine, you're saying something.
When you click on the link that Alan provided to us, there's a little red rectangle that says leave and join. At the top, it says join new meeting. You will have to leave this meeting to join the new meeting.
Yes. Are we ready to do that? Anything before we all say goodbye and then jump over to part 2?
I think we need to give our speakers a big round of applause because it was so excellent. Of course, we can't
Yes,
see all the
indeed.
panelists.
Thank you for that. Yes.
Excellent.
3 incredible speakers. And by the way, this is not the first time these 3 people have been on a panel together. So we are repeating history. I know that Tom and Maureen could argue for forever, pretty much. My feeling is they're essentially saying a lot of the same things in a different way, from a different direction. And maybe we'll get them, maybe we'll do that debate someday. Just have that debate. It might be fun. And nobody gets to throw anything. So if we could, can we all click on this other Zoom and then
Join.
say goodbye? And thank you so much.
See you on the other side, as they say.
Yeah, and
Yes.
those of you who had questions in the chat here, put them in the new chat and we will get to them. And we should be able to speak to one another as well. Bye-bye.